Well, thank you everybody for joining today for this Quai University call. My name is Dr. K, and today I'm going to be talking more in depth on how we accomplish sharding of data within Qui Network. And before we get started, I always want to just do an introduction real quick about Qui Network and what we're trying to achieve. And what it comes down to is there's currently narrative within the crypto space that we need to be able to onboard the next 1 billion users. However, there's only 700 million traditional finance users in the world, and the focus is to onboard people into DeFi and get 1 billion users into DeFi. But it seems somewhat incredulous to us that if there's only 700 million TradFi users, that you could expect to get 1 billion DeFi users. So our thesis is that if crypto is going to service 1 billion users or even 8 billion users, that it first needs to function as money before it starts focusing on niche financial applications. So the goal of Quai Network is to create a network that can function as money. To do that, we have to understand our scaling requirement. And if we look at electronic payments as they exist currently, we can roughly estimate that we need about 50,000 transactions per second to service effectively the internet connected parts of the world. And the way that we go about doing this is through a multi-chain architecture. So at Quai, we have a hierarchy of merge mine blockchains that can dynamically increase throughput by increasing the number of blockchains in the network as demand requires. So you can kind of see a traditional blockchain there on the left. The first gen blockchain is just a single sequence of blocks, one after the other, whereas Quai is effectively many threads of blockchains which are coordinated via the dominant threads in the hierarchy. So this is a continuation of kind of a technical deep dive. So we did sort of a summary of all the things that Quai is doing, and we've dove into overviews, and now we're going into a little bit deeper coverage. And today we're going to be covering a little bit more about how we're doing sharding. Specifically, a lot of focus is paid to the objective inter-shard referencing, or how do we coordinate chains without bridging. So the first thing that we need to talk about is merge mining. So merge mining is the process of having a miner commit to multiple data in multiple chains or contexts at once while mining a header. So unlike a traditional blockchain where a miner just has a single header that's referencing a single chain that they process transactions for, in Quai, a miner must always be producing blocks and headers in 3 contexts. So they must be referencing prime, they must be referencing region, and they must be referencing a zone. But they get to self-select what region and zone they want to do work in. So when they do that, they build a header, and that header has information from all 3 of those contexts simultaneously. And then what they do when they're mining is they're looking for a nonce. And that nonce is effectively a random piece of data which is used to be hashed with the header to try to produce a hash which meets a thresholding criteria for becoming a block. And if they are mining and they're mining that nonce and they achieve a zone threshold, they'll find a zone block, and the data in referencing region and prime will be superfluous. It's just extra data that's in the header that's not canonical, it's not really referenceable, it just exists. But everything in the zone part of the header would be canonical referenceable data. So effectively what they've done is they found a zone block. Now, if they get a little bit luckier and they meet the region thresholding criteria, they'll find a region block. They'll also simultaneously find a zone block. which means the data in the header that is now referenceable is the data that's both in the region part as well as the zone part. And then if they find a prime block, they'll find simultaneously a region block and a zone block with that prime block. So now they'll have 3 blocks that are valid in 3 different contexts, but they'll all have the same hash. So because there's a single nonce and there's a single set of data in the header, that block in prime and in region and in zone will have a common hash, which is very important. Now, the other thing that's important with merge mining is that this allows miners to process in multiple sharded contexts without sharding work, because all miners are also working region and also working prime. It means that everybody is working the prime blockchain. So over time, everybody is committing to everything that's being committed to in the prime ledger, which means you don't instantaneously get everybody working the chain, but you eventually get everybody working the chain. So that effectively is saying that we're able to shard data without having to shard work. So the next thing that we want to talk about here is a Merkle tree. And the Merkle tree is a pretty important concept because it allows us to create a concise proof of included data. And this is used ubiquitously within blockchain. So I just want to make sure everyone sort of has this background before we keep going. But effectively what it does, it's a binary tree, and it allows us to create a series of hashes that all roll up into a single hash, which is then referenced in the header. So if we go back one slide, we can see in zone we have a root hash. And that root hash here is the hash of this sort of top block. Now that hash contains all of the transactions or all of the body data that's included in the zone block. So we don't, directly put all of the data in the header because we need to be able to quickly transmit and reference headers. But we do need to prove what data we're committing to in a block. So a block really has 2 pieces. It has a header and it has a body, and that creates a block. The body is made up of the data, which is rolled up into the root hash. And the way that it's rolled up is via a Merkle tree. Now, specifically for us, these are Patricia Merkle trees, but for the concepts that we're trying to convey here, just thinking of it as a simple binary tree is sufficient. So what we do here is the transactions. In this example, we have 4 transactions, and we're trying to prove that this block has those 4 transactions in them. So basically what we do is a transaction will have a bit of data. It'll have an address, it'll have a destination, it'll have a value, gas, so on and so forth. If I take all of that data and I create a hash of it, I now have a hash of the transaction, which would be these hashes here, H00, H01, so on and so forth. And then when I go up one more layer in the tree, I create a hash of the 2 hashes. So if you look at H0 is a hash of both H00 and H01. And then I do one more level in the tree, and I hash together H0 and H1, and I'll end up creating the root hash. And then what this does is if I show somebody the data, TX1 through 4, they can recompose this tree and show that those transactions are indeed in the root hash, which is indeed referenced in the header, so that we know that the data that's committed to in the body of a block is the data that's committed to in the header. So then the next question is, now that we kind of have that background of what a Merkle tree is, and we understand that we're sharding our system into multiple blockchains, the question becomes, how do we have only one root in only one zone, only one root in every header chain, but we make it such that the zones don't overlap with each other? And the way that we accomplish this in Quai is through a process that we call address sharding. So we can kind of think of this as like a scoping or a permission, and that a given EVM, say Cypress 1, is only allowed to operate on addresses which are assigned to the Cypress 1 chain. So when you're using an address in Quai, it is assigned to one of the EVMs, one of the blockchains, and only that blockchain can originate a state transaction that's using state that's under that address. So we've sharded the address space. So if you create an address and it has the first 2 bytes between 00 and 1D, only Cypress 1 will be able to make a state modification, originate a state modification to any funds in that account. And in doing this, we can guarantee that Cypress 2 can't modify things that Cypress 1 can modify, and that Paxos 1 can't modify things that Cypress 1 can modify. So by sharding the address space, we guarantee sharded execution within the hierarchy of blockchains. So only one chain can modify any address, and ETXs are the mechanism that we use to transfer state. So when you do a transaction in a blockchain, so intra-chain, so to speak, in just Cypress 1, the method of initiating that transaction is a signature. And so it is a transaction that only has to get consumed and use state from Cypress 1, and it's going to output state into Cypress 1. And so all Cypress 1 has to do to understand that that's a valid transaction is to check the signature that is made by the private key associated with that address. And then obviously run all the EVM and transition rules. So it's using the signature as the mechanism to trigger a state change. When we talk about ETXs are produced by ATX. So if I do a transaction, and I do a transaction to Cypress 1, but it has an output that goes to Cypress 2, while the EVM is executing, it is going to create an ETX object. And that ETX object will eventually be consumable by Cypress 2. And we can think of that very much as like a UTXO in some ways. The mechanism by which Cypress 2 knows that the ETX is valid, though, is not a signature, it's inclusion in Cypress 1. So effectively, Cypress 1 would be quote-unquote signing an ETX by including it in Cypress 1 so that when it gets to Cypress 2, as long as it's been included in 1, 2 knows that it's valid. Now, what's the impact of having a sharded address space? There's an impact on liveliness, obviously. So if I'm doing intra-chain operations and internal transactions, I'll be as lively as a zone block. So you'll get behavior that's very similar to 10-second blocks in Ethereum. Now, if I do an ETX, I can still get the state transition to commit to in the origin, and I can create estimations of the likelihood of getting included in the destination, but I won't be able to re-reference any outputs until it's included and finalized in the destination chain. So the disadvantage to ETXs is that they have to wait for global referencing. But again, this is the one trade-off with being able to achieve scale. So sharding address space guarantees our computation atomicity and makes sure that 2 chains can't be trying to operate on the same state simultaneously. Now, this gets a little bit into tree organization, because it's important that when we're organizing our structure and we're sharing data, we want to do it in a way that's easy to reference and allows us to only send data that we need to send when we need to send it. So there's a little bit of a meta that goes on with Quai, in that if you think about the fact that we only have a single root in the header, you can kind of think of us, and we have a sharded address space, we're kind of actually modifying a single state tree. We're just permissioning different environments to be able to do different modifications over different time. And then we're eventually letting the other people reference it if there is something to be referenced. But in some ways, you can kind of think of Quai Network having, this 3x3 architecture with 9 zone chains as really just having a single state tree. And so because of that, it's incumbent upon us that we would want to organize it in a reasonable manner to reflect that. So the tree organization is ordered by address, which is a normal organization mechanism for account-based state trees. But the interesting thing is that different branches of the tree effectively hold state from different zones. And depending on where we are, we'll have different liveliness guarantees. So if I'm in Cypress 1, Cypress 1 is going to be actively, modifying the left-hand side of this tree. And the only time that Cypress 1 is going to, quote unquote, make entries or modify the part of the tree that's from Cypress 2 is when an ETX arrives and makes an entry. And then there'll be an entry that exists in Cypress 2 that's sort of made in the Cypress 1 version of the state tree. Now, the interesting thing about that, though, is that's effectively cut through. So Cypress 1 has no knowledge of all the events or transitions that led up to a Cypress 2 entry in its ledger. All it knows is that Cypress 2 created an output, and that output ended up becoming referenceable in Cypress 1. So Cypress 1 is assuming it's effectively valid now. So it only sees that one entry output when Cypress 2 decides to interact with Cypress 1. So it's really good because we effectively get cut through, so we get a reference state from 2 in 1 without having to see any of the activity that went on in 2. So, if you did 10 Uniswap transactions, and then sent one of those outputs to Cypress 1, Cypress 1 wouldn't know anything about the Uniswap transactions. It would just know about the single output. So we're only, again, sending the data that we need, when we need it, to where we need it. The other thing that's great about this tree organization is it allows us for trimming. And I'll get to the trimming in just a second. But before we get to trimming, I do want to dive into coincident blocks a little bit more, because coincident blocks are sort of the fundamental mechanism for how we're doing information coordination within the system, and it's the mechanism by which we are eliminating bridging. So when we go back to the merge mine slide, we said, if a miner finds a block which meets the prime threshold, they've simultaneously created a block in prime, region, and zone. So it's a block that's valid in 3 contexts that has a shared singular hash, and the fact that I have that shared hash in those 3 contexts creates a hash-linked reference between the chains, and that's the mechanism by which the destination chains reference the cross-chain transactions from the origins. The important part about the coincident blocks, though, is that they only happen periodically. And when there isn't a coincident block, the chains are independently and asynchronously progressing. And only at coincidence is synchrony enforced within the hierarchy for the parts of the hierarchy that are being modified by that coincident block. So if we kind of look at this graph here on the very far left, we can see we have a coincident block in Cypress 1. So when that coincident block is found, effectively Prime, Cypress, and Cypress 1 all have to make this state transition simultaneously. However, Cypress 2 doesn't know anything about it, nor does Paxos 1, nor does Paxos 2. So these guys are just running along, asynchronously progressing. It's just there's enforced synchrony that's taking place on the append and progression at that point of coincidence. So coincident blocks allow objective reference between chains. Did you have something, Brenny?
Synchrony happens when a transaction is sent between chains, right? At that point, there are coincident blocks.
No, so coincident blocks happen via mining. So if you send a transaction, it doesn't immediately create a coincident block, it gets queued. And then when a coincident block is found, that creates a reference to the queue, effectively. So in our body, we have transactions and we have external transactions. And these external transactions are effectively accumulating. And then when we find a coincident block, they clear. Right? So that external set is now going to start being referenceable and propagated throughout the network. But they don't sort of leave the origin until you get a coincident that references in. And this should become a little bit more obvious in this slide. So the question is, how are we doing the propagation? When are we doing the referencing? And when are things, quote unquote, globally finalized so that we can re-reference an ETX at the destination? So let's say in this particular example, I have two transactions. I have transaction 1, which is going to cause a ETX, and it's going to cause a send between Cypress 1 and Cypress 2. And you can see it there sort of in the lower left. So this block, the very first block in the lower left, I've included a transaction, TX1. Now, I have another transaction in this example that I'm calling TX2, which is originating from Paxos 2 up there. And TX2 is going to go from Paxos 2 to Cypress 2. Now the question is, when does Cypress 2 see transaction 1 and transaction 2? And how does it see it? So as Cypress 2, and as we're starting, there's no time here, right? So all of these things are asynchronous, but just relatively speaking on like relative positions, we can kind of say for this example that the TX1 and TX2 sort of happened at the same time. And roughly speaking, the blocks that seem to be sort of collinear with those two blocks are also roughly the same time, so to speak. Again, completely asynchronous. There's not relative time in this case, but for our example, let's just say all the blocks on the left-hand side were created at sort of T0. Yeah. So then what ends up happening is Cypress 2, has this block that was created kind of when TX1 and TX2 were created, but Cypress 2 can't see the fact that Paxos 2 and Cypress 1 are making transactions that it can eventually reference yet. So Cypress 2 is going to go ahead and it's going to keep on mining here. We find another block. It's a zone block, so we don't get any external transactions referenceable. But then we find a region block. And when we find the region block, we've now created new hash-linked references that are provably followable in Cypress 2 back to Cypress 1 and the external transaction that was originated in Cypress 1. So there's a link, there's a coincident block from the Cypress 1 block to Cypress, and then there's a parent hash link from that block to the previous Cypress region block. And then there's another coincident block hash link from Cypress down to Cypress 1. So that path highlighted in yellow is now all objectively available in Cypress 2. So Cypress 2 has the set of hash links needed to reference transaction 1 in Cypress 1. So now it can include or re-reference the output of that transaction in Cypress 2. So in the subsequent block, it can now use that transaction. So then we keep mining in Cypress 2, and we're still finding zone block, zone block, zone block, so no new referenceable external transactions. Now eventually we get to this coincident prime block in Cypress 2, and now Cypress 2 can finally see the transaction that was originated in Paxos 2, transaction 2. and transaction 2 is now objectively referenceable. So Cypress 2 now has a set of hash link references that point all the way back to transaction 2. And you can see that path. So there's a coincident block, there's a parent block, there's another coincident block, another parent block, another coincident block. But Cypress 2 is objectively seeing the ETX that was generated in Paxos 2. So now that ETX is available and referenceable in Cypress 2. Cool. So then the other item that we do is we're referencing data in different contexts. So the only data that we reference is the data that, the only data we send is the data that we must send. And we only get a reference data that we should be able to reference. And we're not going to reference data that we can't be able to reference. So, you know, if we go back one slide and I'm looking and, you know, I'm in Cypress 2 now, there's technically internal transactions that I could objectively create hash link references to in Paxos 2 from Cypress 2. But from Cypress 2's perspective, those are sort of meaningless transactions, and they're non-operable transactions because they're on state that Cypress 2 isn't allowed to modify. So great. But what that means is that when we send the data, we have to send part of the block from Paxos 2 to Cypress 2 so that it can be referenceable. So what we do is if we look at this root construction again, this is a more abstract version of it. But effectively, you know, our root is referencing all of the data in the body. So we have in the root, we'll have transactions, but we'll also have these external transactions. And like I said, external transactions are sort of accumulating and then get cleared on coincidence. Now, if we get a coincident block, we're going to have an ETX set that's now referenceable external to our origin. And we're going to need to propagate the data that is referenceable so that our destination knows what transactions are available for it, external transactions. But we don't want to have to broadcast the whole block. So what we do is we end up trimming the block, and we only send the data that we have to send. So in the case that I'm sending data to Cypress 1, I'm not going to send the whole block from Paxos 2. I'm going to trim out my internal transactions, and then I'm going to only send it the part of the ETX tree that's relevant to Cypress 1, and I'm going to trim out all other ETX branches that exist. And then I will also include a Merkle path or a proof that allows me to trace the data for the destinations ETXs back to the root hash referenced in the block. So trimmed blocks allow us to propagate only data that is needed only to the places where it needs to go. And when we talk about propagation too, we want to minimize the amount of data propagating through the network. So when we get one of these coincident blocks, we've created a new set of ETXs that may eventually be referenceable in some destinations. So what we want to do though is we want to instantaneously propagate these candidates because we don't know if the destination is going to ultimately reference that block or not because we haven't referenced it. We just think it may reference that block. So we can forward propagate or optimistically propagate our trimmed blocks with our external transactions, and we can then at the destination hold those in sort of a block candidate pool set. So we have this set of blocks from all of our sort of sister blockchains. We don't know which ones we're going to be able to reference, but we have all the data. So then what happens is when they're finally referenceable, we finally find the coincident blocks. All I'm looking for now is a set of hash links that will tell me which of the blocks out of the candidate set are now usable. So that's a very small amount of data, you know, on the order of a couple KB. So we don't have this sort of bursty data propagation. I can just look at that couple kilobytes and then I can pull all of my references out of my pool and construct my new set of transactions and immediately progress. So what we've done with the instantaneous propagation is that we're guaranteeing that from a data standpoint, we're globally consistent when new coincident blocks are found. But that data is only eventually usable or canonicalized when a coincident block is actually referenced in. So one of the things that we do is we have these different nodes, right? And the different nodes are running with a different peer set, and they have different parts of the state tree. So when we find one of these dominant blocks, we need to start propagating relevant data to our potential destinations. And when we do that, we do it using this subdom relationship path through the hierarchy. So if, say, I'm running a full node, just for simplicity, I made this a 2x2 ontology. But if Cypress 1 sort of finds a prime coincident block, it's going to now have a set of ETXs that likely need to get referenced everywhere else in the hierarchy, but we don't want to send that any further than it needs to go. So it will have an ETX tree that's filled with ETXs that are referenceable, that are potentially usable in Cypress 2, Paxos 1, and Paxos 2. So it's going to send its trimmed block, but its full ETX set up to its dominant region node, Cypress. But then Cypress is only going to send 1/3 of that. So Cypress is going to trim off all the data it doesn't need to send down to Cypress 2. So it will only send the Cypress 2 ETX set to Cypress 2. And then it will propagate up the remaining 2/3 of the block to its prime node. And then that prime node, in this case, doesn't need to do trimming because we're in a 2x2 tree, but we'll send that down to the region node, our Paxos. And then Paxos will cut that into 2 different pieces and then only propagate the piece that needs to go to the ultimate destination. So then the destinations only end up in this example with 1/3 of the already trimmed ETX set, so that they're only seeing the data that's referenceable to them and nobody else's data. So we're doing de minimis data propagation and continuous trimming during propagation, sort of within the nodal hierarchies, to make sure that as we're sharing data across contexts, we're not wasting bandwidth. So continuous trimming of blocks allows minimal data propagation. And so I'll leave you guys with a question today, which is a little bit of a meta. Is Quai one blockchain or many blockchains? Because if you think about the fact that we're using one state root, we just have different degrees of liveliness, and all sort of transitions are atomic and sequential and referenceable, the construction becomes unclear, so to speak. So people can noodle on if we're one blockchain or many blockchains. And with that, I'll take questions.
But if you wanted to give both sides those arguments for why being one blockchain or a portion of blockchain, it'd be fun to hear your take too.
I mean,
people are typing right now, so I'm just running questions quickly.
yeah. So I'll kind of give you my answer. At this point, I don't know if I can defend the many blockchains. I originally thought it was many blockchains, but then, like once you get to Poem and once you kind of understand how Poem works, and then you couple that with how coincident blocks work, and how, right, there's one organized state tree that's sharded by address space. I would start to argue it's a blockchain. So I don't know if I can actually run the counter argument. Now, when Region and Prime had their own state roots, that certainly would pretend an argument towards many blockchains. But with the introduction of Poem and the elimination of state within Region and Prime, I think it's a single blockchain at this point.
What defines a blockchain? Is it a consensus mechanism? If yes, then it should be a single chain because then the zones inherit from Prime. No? So.
Oh, yeah, no. So with Poem, actually, the zones are making the decisions independently. So Poem is this really weird thing because it allows the threads to operate an independent decision maker of what head to choose, but Poem's construction guarantees that each independent decision always makes the same choice with every other independent decision. But the zones are strictly picking their tips. It's just they'll always pick to cooperate, and they'll always agree, even though there's literally separate threads running, independently making the choice.
Gotcha.
And that's like the really trippy part of Poem, right? So I think that's part of the question. The first half of the question was, that was the inherent part. What was the first part of the question?
The first part of the question was, what defines a blockchain? Is it the consensus mechanism, or what is it that defines a nation?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and honestly, about a year ago, as we were trying to construct this thing and actually implement it, we were having difficulties because if we were referencing prior implementations, the question of what is a blockchain seems to be a basic question, but it really is not. And only we literally had a day where we were like, how the hell is this supposed to work? This is not good. And so we sat down, and the first question of the day was, what is a blockchain? And it was only through proper definitions and separation of what a blockchain is and what those questions are that we're able to do what we're doing. So at the very basic form, right, a blockchain is a chain of blocks. So to be a blockchain, I need to have sequential numbers referencing each other by a hash with some sort of state that's mutating in each block. That's the very fundamental of it, right? So, and within a blockchain, I said there's some state. Now, in reality, a blockchain isn't the primary construction. A header chain is the primary construction. So the header chain is the first question, because I can create a series of blocks, and we can have a consensus mechanism on how we order the blocks and which blocks we work on without even having state, right? So the underlying question is, how do you create headers, and how do you create header chains? And then once you answer the question of how do you create header chains, then we can start decorating it with blocks. But the decoration of blocks is relatively trivial if you can answer how to do the header chain. So a blockchain in and of itself isn't even the construction that you should worry about. It's just the header chain. And then if you look at Quai and the fact that, right, prime and region are both just header chains, and then we've only decorated zones with bodies to make blocks, right, you can see that this construction it's like we have a super header chain that we decorate with bodies now and again that now and again can sort of reference each other. And that's why this starts to seem a lot more like a single blockchain than many blockchains. But yeah, no, the question of what is a blockchain, right, that's the answer. It's just a block with references. Now, if we're talking about a cryptocurrency then must have an economic Byzantine fault tolerant mechanism of consensus. And the only thing that I would argue meets that criteria is some sort of work-based mechanism, right? So proof of work, Nakamoto consensus is obviously one way to do that. And Poem is certainly an evolution of proof of work. Yeah, well, and then you actually have to define it as, what are the components of a blockchain and sort of what are its sort of fields of definition, right? So if we say look at a header chain, what defines a header chain? A Genesis block defines a header chain, right? A mechanism, the consensus mechanism will pick sort of what we think our longest chain is or what chain we should work on, but that's independent of the header chain. So really, a Genesis block plus a sort of current block with sequential numbering and parent hash references, that's a header chain. That's the definition. So to make a header chain, I need a number, I need a parent, I need a Genesis, and I need a current block. Those four things define a header chain.
Gotcha.
And if you add anything else to it, like bodies or state processors or blocks, and you start thinking about how to do this with those pieces in it, you're screwing it up, right? So like you very much have to like only think about the piece that you need to think about when you need to think about it. And if you try to conflate it with anything else, you can't make any room on solving these problems.
Right. One other question here is clarifying question on coincident blocks. So the question is, what are the benefits to coincident blocks, or are they issues that you're trying to curb in the network?
No, I mean, coincident blocks are these great constructions because it allows us to use the mechanism of chain tip extension work to create interchain references in a dominant strategy incentive compatible way. So coincident blocks in no way are like an add-on or a remnant. They're just this beautiful sort of fundamental construction of how you can do this thing using merge mining.
Got it. Cool. Well, that's all the questions that we have in the chat. So unless you have anything that you want to add in or clarify.
No, I appreciate everybody from coming. Great questions today. Yeah, we'll see you next time.